Our final speaker of the session is Robert Collins.
Hello and good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about some of my thesis research. In particular, I'm interested in the influence of prior experience on the encoding of repeated events in the future. So the brain is a very expensive organ, using approximately 20% of our basal metabolic energy rate, despite only accounting for about 2% of our total weight. So there's a tremendous evolutionary pressure to develop efficient and effective attention and encoding systems. One way you can develop an efficient learning system is by minimizing the amount of encoding you do for redundant information. That is, information that is already well encoded in the brain. So one tool we use that we believe gets at this idea in our lab is the repetition decrement effect. So Tammy just went over this in her prior presentation, but for anyone who's just joining us right now, I'm going to go through the procedure once more. So the repetition decrement effect procedure involves an incidental study phase consisting of not repeated targets and repeated targets. Each trial consists of a fixation cross, followed by a green prime word, and finally a red target word, with the participants instructed to name those red target words aloud as quickly and accurately as possible. Following a 10-minute math distractor phase, participants then complete a surprise whole new recognition memory test. So in the previous presentation, participants simply ignored the prime, but in this experiment, I decided to run 3 groups. The first is once again just a replication of the ignored condition, but the latter 2 groups that I run involve participants paying attention to the prime. In the first of those 2 groups, participants name the prime just like they do with the target word, and in the second of those 2 groups, participants answer a semantic question about the prime. Specifically, can you touch this? So for truck, you would say yes. For pride, you would say no. All right. So the idea here was that if the repetition decrement effect actually reflected a deficiency in the encoding of redundant information, then robust encoding of the prime should insulate you against those negative encoding effects. So what do we get? Well, I plotted the corrected hit rate on the y-axis and the prime encoding task here on the x-axis. So when participants ignore the prime, we once again replicate that repetition decrement effect. Better memory for those not repeated target words than for those repeated target words. But what happens when participants pay attention to that prime? Well, it turns out when they name the prime, just like they do with the target, we get a small positive effect of repetition, though it's non-significant. And when participants robustly encode the prime with a semantic encoding task, we get a very large boost in memory for those repeated targets relative to those not repeated targets. So we have shown that we get a repetition decrement effect for immediate repetitions of ignored words. And we attributed this effect to the deficient processing of primed words. So this actually got us thinking about the spacing effect. One of the primary mainstream theories of the spacing effect is the deficient processing theory, which holds that primed words are subject to an encoding decrement. So words that are spaced closely together suffer from this encoding decrement more than words that are spaced further apart. And this is what creates the typical improvement in spacing with improvement in memory with increasing spacing to the lag. So we thought, what would happen if we inserted a delay between the repeated items in our study? This is not really a trivial question. This is not really a trivial question on account of the fact that we're not aware of any spacing effect studies which indicate that delaying the repetition of a word that is initially ignored ought to improve memory. So how do we achieve this spacing manipulation? Well, first, we added a second block, study block consisting of just red target words. Once again, in this block, we have not repeated targets and repeated targets. So to create those repeated targets, we simply used words that hadn't been seen in block 1. But to create these spaced repeated targets, what we did was we took some of the not repeated targets from some of the not repeated primes from block 1 and showed them in block 2 as targets that were to be named aloud. So what we'll do, we'll call these guys here immediately repeated targets because they're repeated after about 1 second. And then these guys down here, spaced repeated targets. The approximate time between this repetition here would be about 10 minutes. So just like before, we have multiple encoding conditions for the prime. We will use the ignore condition and the name condition that we mentioned in the last study, but we're going to drop the semantic condition because the uncorrected hit rate for the semantic encoding task was at ceiling in the prior experiment, and this would obscure any potential benefit that could be added due to spacing. So we have two comparisons of interest here. We can look at the immediately repeated words compared to their not repeated targets to check to see if we replicate that repetition decrement effect as well as that small, for ignored words, and that small positive benefit for named primes. And then we can look at these spaced repeated targets compared to their not repeated targets to see what kind of effect we get when we delay that repetition. And the interaction between these two will tell us something about whether the spacing effect and the repetition decrement effect actually share a common underlying process. So what do we get? Well, when ignored primes are repeated immediately, we once again get that repetition decrement effect. And when primes are named aloud, we once again get a positive repetition effect, although this time it's actually significant. But what about those delayed words? Well, it turns out that when we delay the repetition of an ignored prime, we actually get a reversal of the effect, a significant interaction in the form of a reversal of the effect, suddenly getting better memory for the repeated targets than the not repeated targets. For the named primes, we also get a significant interaction, this time driven by an increase in the size of the repetition benefit. So the results show that we get repetition decrement effect for ignored primes that are repeated immediately. And it seems that this is a short-term effect that affects the encoding of immediately repeated items but not spaced repeated items. The interaction does provide preliminary evidence that these two effects are linked by a single common underlying process, but there's a problem here. What we measured was not actually a true spacing effect, and that's because the interaction alone is not a true spacing effect, and that's because it is conflated by the retention interval differences for the items in block 1 and the items in block 2. Specifically, the items in block 1 have to be held onto for an additional 10 minutes over those items in block 2. So a more robust design will be necessary to make any strong conclusions about the repetition decrement and spacing effect being intrinsically linked. So how did we solve this issue? Well, first, we returned to a single study block design. Now, rather than vary the amount of spacing between study blocks, we decided to vary it within the same study block. So we still have these not repeated items here, and we still have our immediately repeated items in this trial phase as well. But now we have a group of new types of repeated trials where the target actually comes from a prime from a previous trial. So in this case, we'll call these guys, for the purposes of this experiment, we'll call these guys lag 0 repeated targets because no items are seen in between the presentation of the prime and the target. And we'll call these guys lag 4 items because you have one trial and a total of 4 words in between the presentation of the first prime and its presentation as a target. This is not an exhaustive list of the items that are included. We also include lag 2 items where the prime of one trial appears as the target on the immediately following trial. And we have lag 8 items where there are 3 intervening trials and a total of 8 words. Critically, this allows us to compare memory for these not repeated targets to memory for these repeated targets to check for that repetition decrement effect again. We can also check it against other lag conditions. But we can also compare memory between the different lag conditions to check for a spacing effect. So, how did this pan out? Well, when we look at the not repeated target words and those lag 0 immediately repeated target words, we once again get that repetition decrement effect, better memory for the not repeated targets. However, if we delay the prime repetition just a little bit, suddenly Well, it still trends in the same direction as worse memory for the repeated targets, but this is now non-significant. By the time we place one intervening trial in between the presentation of the prime and target in the lag 4 condition, we now have completely wiped out that repetition decrement effect. It is now completely equal in memory for the not repeated targets and the repeated targets. But also importantly is we get a significant spacing effect when comparing those lag 4 items to the immediately repeated lag 0 items. This trend continues with the lag 8 items, although the performance gains are a little bit smaller in this case. And performance by this point is starting to trend a little bit in the direction of better memory for those repeated targets. And once again, we get a significant spacing effect when comparing them to the immediately repeated targets. So we have shown that you can get spacing effects for briefly presented but ignored prime words. And second, we have learned that the repetition decrement effect represents a transient deficiency in the encoding of repeated items. Our claim here, the strong claim anyways, is that what we're measuring is actually direct measure of that deficient processing mechanism that's been theorized for so long to cause the spacing effect. Of course, I mentioned at the beginning that I believe that this is an effect of redundancy, but redundancy cannot fully explain the effects that we're observing here. Consider, for instance, if only those processes that are explicitly redundant are dropped from the encoding of repeated items, then why isn't the combined representation of the prime and target at least simply equal to that of a target you see and name once? It doesn't make sense that it would be remembered worse off. So what this actually points to is something more similar to, say, Bjork's new theory of disuse, which is that the retrievability of an item in the moment globally depresses the amount of attention and encoding resources we allot to that, the encoding of that item. Of course, there's an alternate explanation. So far we've framed this repetition decrement effect as a cost for repeated item encoding. But it could be that the repetition decrement effect actually represents a benefit for the encoding of novel information. Consider research on event segmentation by Psych'd. So in this framework, prediction error forms the basis for which event boundaries are created and episodes are segmented in memory. When predictions are fulfilled, information is simply rolled into the existing event file containing the old information. And when predictions are defied, this results in the creation of any new event structure. Now, it turns out that Psych'd has shown that these segmentation points are really important for the storage and retrieval of information. And in the context of the repetition of decrement effect, what could be occurring there then is that we first get a prime, which is encoded quite poorly, and then we see the repeated target, which fulfills our expectations, causing that repeated target to be combined with the existing degraded event containing the prime. Alternatively, the not repeated targets are encoded as a new episode because they don't conform to any prior expectations. Now, this is actually the end of the presentation, but I just want to point out that this is a potentially cool avenue to investigate because it could link the study of attention with the study of memory. I'll just quickly bring up, consider some theories of negative priming relying on confusion over the old new status of the item to generate that poor response time. So if you'd like to talk more about that, I'm available to talk after the presentation, but otherwise I'm just going to end it there and say thank you, everyone. Yes.
Excellent, complete piece of work. Congratulations. What do you think is the nature of the mechanism that's operating or creating these time-bound functions? Do you think that there's sort of a bubble in time where you're operating in one system where you get this mechanism that then punishes you for redundancy in test, and then that mechanism gets released over time because something occurs outside of that mechanism's purview? Or do you think that this is maybe something like a forgetting function where as time passes, the memory of events change or get lost so that the redundancy becomes less and less identifiable. And so you start to get a different effect in that redundancy, so it doesn't function.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I'm just going to back up to this slide. Actually, I think it's pretty funny that I think the pattern of data that you see in the lag function here very closely mirrors almost like an inverse of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So I think what we're looking at is something that's like asymptotic, is that the word I'm looking for? So the deficient encoding will linger for quite some time, but it's been reduced to near zero after some amount of spacing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, whether it's a working memory effect or whether it's a forgetting function that's responsible for the nature of that. I think that's an interesting question to explore.
I probably lean more towards forgetting.
Yeah.
Chris?
To what extent are people, and some of the ways in which you sort of framed it is like brain, you decide not to encode the second thing when it's repeated because of the fact that it's redundant. And I'm wondering to what extent are people actually volitionally downregulating encoding, or to what extent are they aware of the fact, like you got JOLs or something?
Yeah.
Are they aware of the fact that a repeated item actually?
Well, we haven't done JOL in this particular paradigm, I don't think. Bruce can correct me if I'm wrong. He might have run it in an earlier study. But
just your intuition.
no, I think it's automatic and involuntary. It occurs with this incidental study phase and a surprise recognition test, and it seems very inflexible to manipulations of intentionality. So yes, there are theories of the spacing effect that do rely on, say, metacognitive inferences about how familiar things are, affecting how much rehearsal you allot to the item, but I don't think that's what's going on here. Yes?
I know it wasn't really focused on presentation, but I do want to ask you about that semantic post-simulation and post-experiment.
Yes.
So I'm curious, do you think that reflects enhanced processing of that particular item, or do you think it's more of a textual memory? So when they say the test, they go, oh, I remember being asked a question about this, as opposed to strong encoding.
That's a good one. That could be driving the effect somewhat, and given some research on the production effect, it seems that if you name something after you semantically analyze it, there's a subsequent large boost in memory. So yeah, I think that's a fair interpretation of what might be going on. I can't disagree with that at all. Yes?
Have you done a study in which the test was to judge whether or not a probe had been presented as a to-be-born item?
To be ignored. So as a prime? As a prime,
yeah.
Okay. Here, we presented the items and tests at white and did probe memory for the primes as well. So this will be a complete set of data, including that prime memory right here. I used corrected hit rates. I dropped the primes from some of these figures just for the sake of simplicity, but sorry, did I not answer?
No, I think now I have to take in the slide. I was just wondering if what happens is that when there's no lag, the to be read aloud thing reminds me makes me aware of the prime in a way I might not otherwise have been. I collapse those two so that in test I say, oh, that's familiar, but that's familiar because it was a prime, so I say no to it.
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason we switched to white words in this one. We didn't want people to think, oh, I saw the word in green, therefore it's not something I want to hit old to. And the instructions do say old if you saw this word in the previous study phase. It doesn't really discriminate between red versus green words. I do want to comment on this slide. This does provide a little bit of extra support for that redundancy account, because if you consider the non-repeated primes to be analogs for the contribution of the repeated primes to memory, you'll note that the performance gain here is much larger when the item is first ignored than when the item is first named. Compare this first bar to that third bar. And there's very little gain associated with naming the target. Ironically, after I just mentioned the production effect, there's very little gain in performance associated with naming the target after it's been semantically processed. Chris, again?
Sorry, just one other question. You framed this as sort of an encoding effect, right?
Yes.
But of course, just from the data you've shown us, it could be that it only arises when you use recognition as a memory test.
Yeah.
So if it's truly an encoding effect, you should see it probably across different kinds of tests, right? So free recall.
Frequency judgments or
Right.
anything like that. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of whether you think it would hold up under different conditions of true?
That's interesting because I've kind of couched this in terms of an item-specific like deficiency in processing. So I know recall tends to rely a bit more on relational encoding between items, so I'm not 100% sure if it would occur in free recall. I can't speak to that. But if Green is right in that all cued memory tests, so any test in which the experimenter provides a retrieval cue to the, if he's right that all those essentially rely on the same process, then I would expect to see this in, say, cued recall, frequency judgment tasks, those type of tasks. Not sure about free recall, and I don't feel confident enough to make a state claim one way or the other.
Technically the end of the session then, so.